All right, good afternoon and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we are going to hear from Peter Brewitt from the University of Vermont on, well, species introductions, reintroduction. For the record.
That's it. All right, well, thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
You need to introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Peter Brewitt, and I'm a senior lecturer at UVM at the Rubenstein School and the director of the Sustainability, Ecology, and Policy program there. My research focuses on the politics of ecological restoration, particularly in the last few years on the politics of species reintroductions. And that's what I'm aiming to share with you all here today. Hopefully offer some perspective and data that might be of use going forward. Before I do go forward, though, I should make clear that I have not researched catamount reintroduction specifically. I've had some conversations about doing that in the future, but so my presentation here will come from my research on other introductions and some other restoration as well, for what that's worth. Now, if my slides were to go forward, just to give you an idea of what you're in for here, I'm going to start out with a couple of baseline sort of concepts, then talk about a couple of the projects that I've worked on related to these issues, and then some kind of bigger issues to bear in mind, takeaways on the subject. Before I go further, I just want to make everybody hear me okay. It's not a big room, but I taught a class earlier today, and so I'm a little hoarse. You may have heard about the idea of the sixth extinction, the idea that we're living through a time of massive extinction comparable with some of the big ones of the past. That topic is debated a lot, but what's not debatable is that we're going through a time of localized extinction, extirpation, that in practically every part of the United States and many other places, formerly resident or even common species have been eliminated with big repercussions for those ecosystems and the human communities that live there. In response to this and to other problems, we're seeing in the last, really I'd say the last 30 years, rise in attempts to restore ecosystems and to do so through translocating or reintroducing formerly present species specifically. It's worth bearing in mind, and this is really the focus of what I'm going to be speaking about here, that these are political decisions, human decisions based on human priorities, and that for that reason, decision to do it or not, the program's success or failure, and what constitutes success or failure is partly going to depend on political support and on social support. To give you a little bit example of what I've pictured here. So beavers used to be common across most of North America, were driven extinct in much of their former range, and then their ecosystem engineers, as I assume you all are familiar with beavers. So the desire to restore them was fairly common. The picture on my right, your left, is a program in Idaho where they wanted to put beavers back into remote parts of that state, but couldn't get in there through vehicles traditionally, so they parachuted beavers into the backcountry with little boxes that kind of opened as they ended. You could see the beaver being like, oh. But at the same time, this kind of thing can be controversial. So in England, beavers, similar species to our North American beaver, were once common, now are gone from the island. There's some halting efforts to try to reintroduce them, but this kind of thing is controversial. People are worried about the implications or don't like change. And so we see one of the experimental efforts, and then the guy had his beavers kidnapped apparently by his neighbors. The first predator reintroduction bit of work that I'm going to share with you is the red wolf, Canis rufus. Not a species that's terribly well known. Maybe, I don't know if you're all familiar with it or not, but this was the native canid dog-like animal of much of the eastern US, from East Texas and Florida up to Connecticut-ish, although the ish was something we'll get into in a second. They were persecuted like most large predators and a lot of small ones well into the 20th century. When officially declared extinct in the wild in 1980, probably effectively extinct a while before that. And then they were actually one of the first species to be put on the endangered species list prior to the Endangered Species Act, actually, and reintroduced in the far east of North Carolina in 1987. If you've ever been to the Outer Banks, this is the peninsula that's the closest mainland to that, and that's where they were reintroduced. About a dozen of them. For the following 20 years, the red wolf numbers rose, and then in the mid 2000s, they began to fall from, as you can see, a peak of about 130. The main cause of this was people shooting them. The nadir of the population was 2020, and there was about 7 left. Over the course of this time, political support fluctuated both in the Albemarle Peninsula and on the state and federal levels. Right now, there's about 30. Now, it's an interesting factor here is that the arrival of coyotes complicated the situation a lot. You can see from the image that coyotes are not identical to red wolves, but look pretty similar. And one of the other things to bear in mind here is that coyotes can interbreed with red wolves and produce fertile offspring. All the big North American canids, domestic dogs, gray wolves, red wolves, coyotes can produce puppies with each other, and those puppies can go on to have puppies. This raised 2 issues. One is hybridization. If you have a puppy that's half red wolf and half coyote, what is that legally? The other is if somebody is intending to shoot a coyote and they shoot a red wolf, it's an understandable accident. If someone intends to shoot a red wolf, they can say they thought it was a coyote and no one can contradict that. What I took from a look at the perspectives of stakeholders in this. Unsurprisingly, some number of people were afraid of wolves. Wolves have a big, scary place in our culture, the big bad wolf and so forth. Others were concerned about the role that they might have in reducing game species, particularly deer, and what it might mean later on for coyote hunting. One of the big issues starting the decline of the red wolf population was the threat to change the regulations around coyote hunting. People didn't like that. Over time, the folks involved in this issue got to question whether or not the red wolf was a real animal, both in terms of being native to North Carolina, but also in terms of whether it was a distinct species or whether it was really just a big coyote. Part of the problem here is that when Europeans arrived in what became North America, the people didn't have any vocabulary for a large wolf-looking thing other than wolf. It's a bit debatable how much genetic variation there was between coyotes in the West, red wolves in the East, and indeed the eastern or Algonquin wolf that formerly lived in Vermont. There is debate on the subject amongst scholars. But amongst red wolf opponents, it became pretty well established that this is not a real animal, that this is an animal that's been foisted upon the people of the region by the government for vague but negative purposes was the perspective. This sparked opposition that then made its way into influencing state and federal perspectives that affected the way the program was run. So that's the red wolf story. Across the water, the other program that I want to talk about a little bit here is Back on Our Map, BOOM. I tell my students that if you want to have, then you should get a good acronym. This is a program that was looking to reintroduce or reinforce 12 different locally extinct or rare species in the northwestern part of England. England is about the most biologically degraded country in the world for its size, but Old England does have a few lessons for us here in New England. One of these was the European pine marten, again, fairly similar to the pine marten that we have here. One of the things that distinguished this program was that the goals were not just ecological, that they were just as much social, to try to engage and educate and inspire and benefit local people, local communities, local stakeholder groups as part of this reintroduction program. Part of this was the choice of species themselves. They started out with a list of more than 100 potential candidate reintroduction species, and through a long process of community consultation, boiled it down to the selected 12. The martens, as the only predator, were a bit of a special case. And there's a bird called a corncrake that was also a feasibility study, but you don't need to hear about that. Because of the extra difficulties reintroducing predators, they went in as a feasibility and educational program, reaching out to various members of the community, speaking to different organizations around the area. Most particularly, I'd point to the feasibility study, giving out 2 surveys. One to the people of the region in general. How do you feel about having pine martens back? What are your priorities about it? And one focused specifically on interested parties, farmers and landowners. Pine martens they're not very big. They don't take sheep or anything like that, but they would eat chickens. They looked not just at how people felt, but also to try to understand the context of the way that people in that region live. How do you deal with pests now? Get an idea with some texture of the environment into which they would be reintroducing pine martens. They did a variety of other efforts at outreach as well. The result of the surveys indicated broad support, including within farmers and landowners, for marten reintroduction. And so as an extension of the project, pine martens were reintroduced in 2024, and there's now more than 30 of them. 2 of them just in the last 6 months disappeared. I put suspiciously in quotes because that's the term the police use for the disappearance of these tagged martens. So those are the 2 projects. And so what I'm going to go into here. Do I have a timer on here? Am I on track for the time that you have?
Yeah, you're good. We have you till 2. With questions.
So I'll just,
It's not quite 30.
I'll just carry on. All right. So my data from looking at archives, interviewing stakeholders, and so on have shown from these projects, and I'm also going to draw a little bit on research from other ecological restoration projects, is the following factors that I found to be important in the political progress of reintroduction and restoration. One of them is that community engagement makes a huge difference, but I would particularly point to engagement at really each step of the process. It's fairly common now for a restoration project to engage with the community, and if before it starts and right during the initial burst of it, to try to make a receptive community for it, but involving the public during implementation, during monitoring, and into the further future than just what we're doing at the beginning mattered a lot. It mattered. And one of the things that it was striking from the Boom project was that a lot of different community groups, some of which didn't have a lot to do with the environment in and of themselves, found a lot of benefit and buy-in from being part of the reintroduction of these various species as an activity, as a way of connecting to heritage and those sorts of things separately from the ecological impacts of whatever the species was. Number 2, obviously, all of the science is really important in all of this stuff. Is there going to be enough genetic diversity for your reintroduced species to establish itself effectively? How's it going to matter for the rest of the environment? What are the knock-on effects, trophic cascades going to be? And communicating all of this really at all levels of relevance in the project is important, but it's not enough. There's sometimes scientists who are involved with these things will say, well, we told them, and that isn't that. What else can you do? And there's more you can do. obviously it's fairly obvious, but as long as people understand what the goals of the project are and what the outcomes are going to be in the short term and the long term, then there's less likely to be opposition. But it's human to sometimes prioritize your own preferences and then work your understanding of science around those preferences. In the sociological literature, this is sometimes called barstool biology. And I'll give you two relevant examples here. One is on my right, your left. There's a video that has I forget how many millions of views on YouTube. Some of you might even have seen it. It's got a lot of hype. Where after the reintroduction of gray wolves, Canis lupus, in Yellowstone National Park in the Northern Rockies, trophic cascade wherein wolves changed the populations of their prey animals, elk and so forth. These species moved across the landscape differently, the opening opportunities for other species, plant species, which then affected the flow of rivers and just generally portrays the reintroduction of wolves as a kind of a magical cure for the ailing ecosystem. This is not totally wrong, but it's not nearly as right as the video would make people feel either. This kind of impact was patchy across different areas and more complicated than you would think. So sometimes people on the one hand latch on to science that agrees with them. On the flip side, this is a community demonstration during the ramp up to the wolf reintroduction. And I've always wanted to speak to the person with the yellow sign about how they came to this conclusion about gray wolves, which are resident across the whole northern third of the world, not being in Western Wyoming. But this obviously was something that somebody believed, felt strongly about, and actionalized politically. Restoration projects tend to bank on either small organizations that are really involved with the issue or smaller units of large organizations. So there's a lot of individual interaction or small group interaction between the people who are making things happen or not, and the kind of the personal qualities of the individuals, aside from their technical training and so on. In engaging with people and interviewing them, I've seen time after time, is the difference between success and failure. That someone who's a good communicator, who's open-minded, who's organized, is more likely to bring people closer to their viewpoint, make people understand their perspective better, form partnerships between organizations, and generally do the kind of work that restoration on a landscape is likely to require. Obviously, this is challenged sometimes by the constraints of whatever organization you work for. You can't go beyond that, and whatever finances you have, that's a hard limit as well. I would point in particular to landscape fragmentation, which I'll talk about in a minute. If you have a landscape where there's lots of different uses and owners and jurisdictions, then it's going to be necessary for there to be more personal connection with the people who oversee those different jurisdictions. If you have a landscape that's mostly large chunks of federal land, like if you live in northern Nevada or something like that, then might be a bit different. On the flip side of that, there's likely to be some number of people who oppose whatever your restoration project is, regardless of anything else. Some of this will have to do with the specifics of the project, but one thing that happens pretty consistently is that people like the landscape that they're accustomed to and prefer that. And that's often a deep-seated feeling that is difficult to change, and then that just have to accept as part of the political landscape, so to speak. In the American political system, a motivated individual or small group can keep fighting for their side more or less indefinitely. You can sue, you can lobby, you can raise awareness in the community. You can do a lot to delay or halt a project. The image here is from the people who didn't like red wolves. There was one guy who was kind of the face of the anti-red wolf movement. And he hired a plane with a banner that said "Google Red Wolf Restoration Scandal," and it went in the newspaper. And so I did. He worked on me, and this created there was an internet chat room sort of where people that this brought you to, and that became a location, virtual location, but real enough politically, where people who opposed red wolves got together to plan action, to inform each other, and so forth. There weren't that many people who were actively involved with this, but those people have an impact. An important issue to think about, especially in a mostly privately owned landscape like North Carolina or Northern England, is spatial scale. I mean, if the project is successful, then the species will eventually spread. And if it's a mobile animal species, it'll spread potentially relatively fast. This will bring it into different people's land that's being used differently and eventually, probably, onto areas that were not part of any initial consultation or coordination. So planning around how the species might expand is one of the big challenges politically. And the other is temporal scale. Humans are impatient as a species, and grants, which often are what funds the projects like this, grants or appropriations, don't tend to last for that long, a few years, whereas the ecology may need decades in order to resolve itself. So how to manage for the long term in a way that is going to be effective for whatever the ecological goal is, but is affordable and continues to engage the necessary parts of the community to make things work, is a big challenge. We see this with dam removals, where most of the dam removals that I've worked with have to do with trying to restore salmon to upper reaches of the river. But the expectation is that it'll take 20 to 25 years before the salmon get to whatever their next state is going to be. Most funding, monitoring, and so forth is not likely to last nearly that long. So with that, I'd be very happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability.
Thank you for your presentation and sharing your work with us. I'd just like to start with a little bit more about your work. You said, like in the last slide, projects you've worked with. How are you engaging with these projects? Are you a researcher, a consultant, or
researcher?
Okay, so you're just following their process. You're not advising.
Yeah, this is a common tension amongst researchers, is how involved to be, but I like to think I'm a personable guy. I feel like I need to not be on anybody's side in order to have my data kind of stand on their own. So I engage equally with all the different parts of it, and then hopefully what I found provides value kind of in it itself.
How many projects have you been involved with?
Depends on how you cut it, but 8, 9.
And can you generalize? You talked a little bit about like the individuals. Like, how are these projects? How have those 8 been motivated? Like, what was the impetus for them?
Why did I want to do the?
No, not you.
How do they start? Well, this sounds a little silly, but I think it's accurate. It starts because of sadness. Along the same lines that an opponent can block progress for a long time, a motivated proponent can do a lot kind of starting from zero. Usually there'll be a small group of people who kind of look at the state of the landscape and either know that it was different before and think we can fix this. And then there's not a lot of laws to guide restoration. Most of our kind of environmental laws say stop bad behavior rather than sparking good behavior. So they look for opportunities within whatever laws exist, within whatever public lands might be possible, and kind of piece it together. A lot of the time, especially in the early days, and some of these projects would have been in the 80s, politics was different. People kind of making it up as they go.
And all of your projects been in this country?
A little bit in England.
Can you do a little compare contrast there?
Yeah, I would say that if you've seen photos of Montpelier, honestly, from like 1880, Northern England looks like that now. no trees, many sheep. And they in that they have almost no native biodiversity. Like if you think of the English countryside from the movies of Jane Austen novels or something like that, it's many people find it lovely, but there's hardly anything there. So they have, but in the kind of ecological or environmental communities there's a growing sense of the desire to rectify that, and some high profile successes as well that have motivated people on. Here, speaking very broadly, I would say that part of the American sense of itself is that it was wilderness when the Pilgrims arrived, that kind of thing. You know what I mean? No, that's a little bit debatable because the indigenous tribes manage most landscapes actively. However, that sense of that it was that this land, wherever in America you are, was wilderness recently, and the idea that that was to some extent part of the creation of the country, and that you could go back to some of that and gain the value from it is a motivator, especially in cases where the loss of the species was relatively recent. I mean, there were wild red wolves in the last population was on the Texas-Louisiana border in bayous there in the 1960s. So, well within living memory. The same kind of thing with some of the salmon runs in the West Coast. Does that make sense? But
Other questions? Representative Austin.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns when I read the report from Fish and Wildlife was the lack of research, to do a feasibility study. And I'm wondering, where would you find compelling research on either side? What organizations or, what data would support either side?
for catamounts?
Mhm.
Well, honestly, replicating the kind of approach that the Pine Marten feasibility study took, I would say would be wise. I don't know enough about, or maybe the plans aren't even far enough along, where a reintroduction site might be, or what people would be most directly involved. But I would say that surveying Vermonters in general and people near the reintroduction sites, particularly people with cattle farmers or dairy farmers rather, are an obvious example, would be a good step to take before the reintroduction of almost any species, particularly one that could feasibly eat calves.
Is there a process that you would recommend after trying out different processes with groups or individuals? Is there a process that you would recommend that seems more successful?
Well, I think it would depend on what your data showed, really. I mean, if you go through a community consultation and it indicates that people are eager to have catamounts return, then you can act on that and can look into the specifics. If it shows that people are opposed, then you may not have the buy-in from the populace to be able to have the kind of social support and public funding and so forth that would make it happen. If you have mixed results where it shows that people are kind of open to it, then you'd have to really go into the specifics and look at things like, and this is again, this is taken from the Pine Marten stuff. What are people expecting out of it? Or do they think there's going to be positive impacts, and what are they? Do they think there's going to be negative impacts, and what are they? How would they react if Pine Marten took their chickens? Would they put up poison? Or what? And then get into it, or a textured account of how the society would react, and base your plan off of that. I would say.
What reintroductions are you following now or researching now?
Well, I've had a lot of thoughts of looking into cat reintroduction, so I was pleased to be here. I've talked with I've talked to some of my students about looking into this stuff. But that's just in the kind of idea stages. Yeah, the other project that I have kind of in mind is Colorado has reintroduced 3 predators in recent years: wolverines, lynx, and wolves. And I'm curious to look at the reaction to each of them. My hypothesis sitting here in this room without having looked at any data is that people are okay with the 2 medium-sized ones and violently opposed or excited about wolves. But I'd be curious to go in more on that and see if people are more up for medium-sized predators rather than big predators.
When you say recently, what does that mean?
Oh, goodness. I don't remember. So the wolves were just a couple of years ago. They're looking to expand the Wolverine program about now, and lynx, I feel bad saying this on the record because I can't remember the year exactly, but I would guess 20 years ago.
Reintroducing lynx, I'm not sure where you get the population of lynx to reintroduce them.
Well, in Colorado, I think they presumably went to Canada, but I haven't, that's a project that I've kind of been piecing together in my mind, but haven't actually started up. The project I'm working on right now is it's this one that a student brought to me about what gets people to do conservation based on her ideas. I'm supporting her in that, and that's my main research effort.
What does get people to support conservation?
We haven't finished analyzing all the data, but we broke it into whether you're framing it as being good for people or good for nature in general. And well, you have to see the paper for sure, but that people have, I was expecting people would side more on this is supposed to be good for the community, where in fact they seem to be embracing conservation for nature's sake a bit more. But yeah, the analyses aren't finished.
Others have questions? About Representative Chapin and then Richard.
I would just love to hear a little bit about your experience, and maybe particularly this is relevant for the North Carolina with red wolves situation. Just, you know, with such a large predator with such a large tendency to move.
Yeah.
And then I'm sort of interested in the regionality needed to support a successful reintroduction of animals, such large territories, as well as the sort of like public university, like the different players in the space of bringing information and looking at feasibility analyses. You know, if our State Department doesn't feel like it's the right move for them, you know, would UVM take a lead on a feasibility study without the state partner, or vice versa? Or is it really important? You know, have you seen in your process work and research that it's really important to have sort of both those players as well as community partners at the table together? Like what in terms of the early stage process makes it possible, makes it most successful, or is it not always important to have all the players on the same page in such an early stage? For example, if you know a university is really gathering that input, like that kind of research that you're talking about, just to even understand how the public feels in general, you know, is that a perfectly good starting place, even if other parties aren't really ready to undertake a feasibility study, or is the feasibility study the key piece, and then after that, it is the right time to bring all the different players? Just what have you seen in terms of that really early stage process, particularly, you know, Vermont's a small state. We've got, you know, another country just to the north of us. You know, how critical is it, or is it not critical to be trying to work more regionally on something like this?
Well, it's a little bit chicken and egg, but I would say that in general, engaging with all the different relevant voices are pretty important. With the red wolf is a bit different because it was a lot of it was a federal role. They were reintroduced on a wildlife refuge. They're federally endangered, so it was the Fish and Wildlife Service that was the main agency that worked there. North Carolina, the Department of, I think it's Department of Wildlife is what they're called. Didn't have a lot of, it was news, didn't have a lot of responsibility early on. At the same time, I would say that if the project is to be successful, then you're going to need buy-in from the state. You're going to need buy-in from big constituents or stakeholder groups, and let's say that at least the opportunity of being part of it would be important for all those people, because nobody likes to be ignored, and when people feel that they're being ignored or marginalized, this tends to turn them against the project, separate from any merits the project might have. As far as the feasibility study, it's the sort of thing that even in the absence of any legal action that somebody like me might do out of academic interest. So you could have a feasibility study that would do the same kind of thing, but it wouldn't be as part of a public program. Does that make sense?
Representative Pritchard.
Thank you. This was great. You talked about public opinion and doing surveys and stuff. I'm just curious how the mix of those surveys occur. And I guess what I mean with that is a rancher in Montana is going to answer that survey a little bit different than somebody living in Bozeman or Whitefish, Montana.
Yes.
Which tends to be the larger population.
Mm-hmm.
So how do those things occur without being skewed? Because the person in Whitefish, Montana or Bozeman, Montana is a lot less worried about the cougar than the rancher, in Montana. So when that opinion is formed, how do those surveys usually work? How do they?
Yeah. Well, this is one of the things that I found worthwhile from the Pine Marten stuff, is that they did two surveys. One was the whole population of the area, which presumably you could do a survey of Vermonters overall, in the same kind of way that you do political polling. But then the other was a targeted survey looking specifically at people who would have an economic concern about this sort of thing. So it would be, in Montana, it would be as if you surveyed just ranchers, maybe, or maybe ranchers and outdoor outfitters that had concerns about what it would mean for elk. Here, I think you'd probably want to survey. And again, I haven't done catamount work, so I might be leaving something out. You'd want to survey livestock farmers, anybody who had sheep, cows, and so forth, and potentially hunters, because the effect on the game population is going to be part of the conversation. So then you end up with two bodies of data. One is, here's how Vermonters feel about it, and then the other is, here's how economic stakeholders. I don't know what umbrella term you might use.
But wouldn't that skew it?
Well,
If you just took the hunters, obviously they're going to have a lot different opinion. And I guess that way I'm trying to figure out is, how do you do that fairly to really get a good, and should it be based on the numbers anyways, because of the geographic makeup of the state?
Yeah, well, it'd be part of why you'd have to be, in discussing your results, you'd have to be pretty clear about it being two different bodies of data. So it's not, so it's two, you have two numbers basically. One broader, one more focused, and you'd be straightforward about this is a survey of these particular people. The other thing that I would suggest in this case would be, if there was an area that you were, I don't know where they would release catamounts if it came to fruition, Green Mountain National Forest, or maybe somewhere in the Silvio Conti Wildlife Refuge, perhaps, surveying the towns in the area, and then producing these more focused bodies of data. And again, not letting them skew each other, but letting them be different from each other, and being transparent about that.
Representative Austin?
Can you talk a little bit more about the sixth extinction? What does
Oh.
that mean?
Well, it's partly comes from the title of a popular book by Elizabeth Colbert, the environmental journalist. The idea being that in the history of the world, there have been 5 big extinctions. The most famous one is the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, where a large percentage of the world's species went extinct. And there's a discourse out there that you're living through the 6th of those now. As human activity drives some species extinct. There's debate about the extent to which whether that's accurate, but that's part of the perception that helps motivate restoration in some ways. I don't have a dog or a cat in the fight on whether or not we're going through the 6th extinction. On a local level, as I said, I just want to be clear, we're in local areas, we've seen the disappearance of a lot of species, but that those species, most of them still live, but in a much reduced range. That's my take on it.
This question may be a little bit out of your wheelhouse, but you've touched on a couple of this. I guess as we've explored wildlife topics and tried to understand human perceptions of abundance, I just was looking at some of the Martin stuff, and it's like it was abundant, but it's so based on the observers and our perception. I guess I'm wondering if you can speak to that. I mean, humans, they want to see certain wildlife and they don't want to see other wildlife.
Yeah, it's a moving target. What constitutes a healthy population of whatever the species is. And that was actually one of the things that motivated the guy who hired the plane for the red wolves was he had a vacation home out there where he'd been accustomed to see deer that really had no stress, that large herds of deer that walked around. And then it's unhappy when the deer were more skittish and not as present. I think that as far as a management concern, if you're trying to manage for abundant populations of whatever species, it's what in a democracy, it's the closest approach to what the people want. It's hard to tell what that might be, but that's the task of ANR or eventually ANR if the species becomes a state managed species. How many of these do we want and how closely can we manage for them? The catamounts, presumably, even if they were fully populating Vermont, would never be that abundant in terms of people seeing them all the time. But the knowledge that they're there would be relevant, whether that's exciting or terrifying. The effect on the one thing that you might see, which again comes from the red wolf stuff and also from gray wolf work that I've been a little bit involved with. If a large herd of elk or deer or whatnot seems normal, then perhaps ecologically you might have a healthier population of those ungulates with predators on the landscape. But if the baseline is that there's a lot of them, and then there's fewer, then people might think that that's bad. So balancing those perceptions and those preferences is the task of management agencies and of all the stakeholders who are involved with these things.
Thanks so much for joining us today and sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Can whoever has a notification on, turn it off, please, wherever that's coming from out there in the.
That's me. If it is, somebody's gonna have to show up.
Shall I sign out?
Me.
One final question.
Oh, sure.
Do you have a dog or a cat?
Yeah.
Oh, I think we're switching out. So we have Renee.
Oh, because I said I didn't have a dog in the, oh, no dog in the fight, but I do have a dog in Hubbard Park.
Okay.
Great. Please join us, Renee. Good.
Okay, I don't have any pretty pictures, so you'll have to just have me today, but. Chair Sheldon and committee members, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. I believe you all have a copy of my testimony. I am here to testify in support of H 473, as well as propose some changes to the legislation. For the record, my name is Renee Secor. I'm from Chittenden, Vermont. I was going to start with a joke that despite it being a pretty good snow day at Killington as I drove by this morning, I hope you guys see my commitment to this initiative and this issue by showing up here today and can understand the magnitude of that decision.
Relate to that commitment thing.
Yes, yes. So I serve as the Northeast Rewilding Director for the organization Mighty Earth. Mighty Earth is actually a global environmental advocacy organization working to protect wild nature and secure a stable climate through a variety of diverse campaigns. My professional background is in carnivore conservation, coexistence, and environmental advocacy work. And my work has focused on advancing science-based approaches to living alongside large carnivores while addressing ecological, social, and community considerations. At Mighty Earth, I lead our wildlife restoration efforts and currently direct our Bring Catamounts Home campaign, which is active in Vermont here on the ground and focused on supporting thoughtful science-based conversations around the long-term future of catamounts in the Northeast. It's in this capacity that I speak with you today to offer our support for this legislation and our willingness to address any questions and assist as you may wish. At the onset, I just want to emphasize our respect for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department for the professionalism and expertise of the department staff. We recognize that Vermont Fish and Wildlife is the state authority on wildlife management, and we view this legislation, H 473, as an opportunity to support and collaborate with the department's work through a science-based analysis of examining the potential restoration of catamounts back to Vermont. We also believe that the question of catamount restoration and the study of its feasibility in particular warrants timely and serious evaluation by the department. The catamount is a native species and an important part of Vermont's ecological and cultural history. Extirpated from the state in the late 1800s under very different conditions than exist today. Many of you may be aware that the preserved remains of the last catamount killed in Vermont in 1881 outside Barnard can be seen right down the street on public display at the Vermont Historical Museum. Alongside an exhibit that actually documents the species' ecological and cultural presence in our state. So although absent from our forests for more than a century, the catamount has remained a cherished cultural icon in Vermont, embedded in our place names, our imagery, and our shared identity as a wild and resilient landscape, and reflected obviously most visibly as the mascot of the University of Vermont. And then a shout out to the Middlebury Panthers too, which is don't want to forget the Panthers. Catamounts are an apex carnivore, as well as a keystone species that play a crucial role in ecosystem dynamics. For millennium, they've helped shape northeastern landscapes by influencing prey abundance and behavior, supporting forest regeneration, and providing carrion, which is carcasses that sustain a wide range of other wildlife species. Research also suggests that intact predator-prey systems can contribute to reduced disease risk and enhanced biodiversity. The return of this missing native species could help restore some of these ecological functions and just overall contribute to a healthier, more resilient forest ecosystem. Since the time of extirpation, Vermont's landscape and ecological context have changed significantly. Forest cover has rebounded from historic lows to roughly 75% of the state, and large connected tracts of habitat now exist across Vermont and the broader region. White-tailed deer populations, the primary prey base for catamounts, are abundant and in some areas overabundant. Scientific understanding of large carnivore ecology and coexistence has advanced substantially, and the public interest in catamount restoration is strong, with recent polling showing a roughly 12-to-1 ratio of strong support to strong opposition in Vermont specifically. Much of this research and the context was actually subject of testimony that this committee received from large carnivore researchers and academics in the first half of the biennium. Taken together, this research and the current landscape conditions raise legitimate science-based questions about whether conditions in Vermont today are adequate for the restoration of this missing native species and what benefits its restoration would provide to our ecosystems. Across the country, state and federal wildlife agencies have used what is called a feasibility study or feasibility assessment to thoughtfully evaluate the return of native species once lost from their landscapes to their former ranges, helping to inform careful place-based dialogue, place-based decisions grounded in science and public process. We believe that Vermont has the opportunity to show similar leadership. Authorizing a feasibility study does not commit the state to a particular outcome, but it does affirm Vermont's willingness to ask informed questions, to reckon thoughtfully with past ecological losses, and to consider what kind of conservation legacy it wishes to leave for future generations. We also view this initiative as supportive of the department's broader conservation work, as outlined in Vermont State Wildlife Action Plan draft, which was recently published, as well as the Vermont Conservation Design. The department has prioritized maintaining and restoring intact, functioning, and connected landscapes as a core strategy for conserving biodiversity, supporting climate resilience, and sustaining healthy ecosystems. Evaluating the feasibility of catamount restoration aligns directly with the department's goals. Research shows that native apex carnivores can help promote ecosystem resilience, influence prey behavior and distribution, and support biodiversity across landscapes, outcomes that are fully consistent with the department's mission and long-term conservation vision. A feasibility study allows the department to assess whether and how this missing native species could contribute to those objectives under modern conditions. We do not believe that leaving these questions unanswered or deferring their evaluation indefinitely is sufficient. And what we mean by that is simply that the department now has enough information and enough change in underlying conditions from the time of extirpation to warrant a structured evaluation. A feasibility study is the tool for how wildlife agencies responsibly determine whether further action is appropriate. Without that assessment, the questions remain unresolved, and neither the legislator nor the public has the benefit of clear agency-led science-based analysis to inform future decisions. So the feasibility study, a feasibility study, as proposed in this legislation, is precisely the appropriate mechanism for the department to assess whether restoration is viable based on existing literature, as well as the benefits and interest in doing so. Beginning that process now allows Vermont Fish and Wildlife to lead the conversation as it moves forward and identify where scientific and management uncertainties remain, rather than leaving those questions unresolved. H473, as introduced, directs the department to conduct a feasibility study examining the potential for restoration of catamounts to Vermont. The bill does not mandate reintroduction, and I just wanted to repeat that that point that the bill does not mandate a reintroduction of catamounts. I think it's an important point to emphasize, as the bill's current title, an act related to the reintroduction of catamounts, might feel confusing or misleading on its face. So instead, the bill asks the department to evaluate a foundational question, which is whether restoration is feasible ecologically, socially, and economically given present-day conditions. In our view, this bill presents a prudent and thoughtful first step in this process. It places the leadership within the department's hands, within Vermont's existing wildlife management framework, and allows trained wildlife professionals to assess the issue using best available science, public input, and importantly, regional consultation with wildlife professionals in other states. We also suggest a few changes to the legislation to respond to concerns that have been raised by the department and other stakeholders. We recognize the department's stated capacity constraints and its need to prioritize ongoing conservation responsibilities. Changes to the bill can help strengthen implementation while preserving the bill's exploratory scope by reinforcing that this effort is focused on information gathering and assessment, Importantly, we suggest changes that outside funding and partnerships may be used to support the feasibility study, to allow the work to move forward without reliance on public funding and without diverting staff capacity from the department's other conservation priorities. I just briefly want to address two questions that have been central to this conversation. The first being, why is a feasibility study an appropriate first step in a process like this? And what does a feasibility study entail under H473? So that first question of why is this an appropriate first step? Feasibility studies in particular are a standard tool used by wildlife agencies in assessing the potential restoration of native species to parts of their historic range. They are often initiated before any decision to restore a species. Across the country, wildlife agencies have actually used feasibility studies as a tool to evaluate species restoration, such as black-footed ferrets, grizzly bears, elk, American marten, and red wolves. These studies have allowed agencies to evaluate key ecological, social, economic, and administrative factors, including things like habitat suitability, potential ecological impacts and species interactions, the potential economic costs of restoration, as well as the benefits, and map out conceptual management pathways for introduced species. And lastly, social consideration, including public attitudes and stakeholder concerns. They also provide an opportunity for structured public and stakeholder engagement to inform the assessment and ensure transparency, and they help identify information gaps and areas requiring further study. Importantly, feasibility studies do not assume or require a particular outcome. To help illustrate the scope of feasibility assessments as have been conducted for other species by wildlife agencies and partnering academic institutions, I have attached examples to my written testimony today, including feasibility assessments conducted for species such as elk and American marten. What a feasibility study would entail under 473. So for H473 reflects several important components that align with best practices and also respect the department's role in a process like this. The first being no mandate to reintroduce. The bill only authorizes a study, ideally led by Vermont Fish and Wildlife. It also prioritizes a science-based analysis. It allows the department to review existing literature thoroughly and identify knowledge gaps that may need further study. It would allow for public and stakeholder engagement, which Peter spoke to the importance of, right? Ensuring transparency in the process and opportunities for community input. And then we would suggest potentially a few changes to the bill. One that would potentially address the allowance for public and private partnership for this bill that could support research and analysis without relying on state funding while keeping the department in charge of the scope and direction of the feasibility assessment. And we would also suggest addressing regional consultation, recognizing that coordination with neighboring states here in the Northeast is an important element of any feasibility assessment for wide-ranging species such as catamounts. So in closing, and then I'm happy to answer any questions if I have answers for you all. In closing, we view H473 as a respectful and measured request for initiating the long-term process of restoring catamounts back to Vermont. Supporting this bill would give Vermont Fish and Wildlife the authority to evaluate a complex conservation question using professional judgment, scientific rigor, and public input. My organization is committed to engaging constructively and collaboratively as this process moves forward. And for these reasons, we encourage the committee to support this bill and allow the feasibility study to move forward. So on that note, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony.
Oh, thank you.
I guess I'm curious a little bit about your background. You said you've worked on other carnivore conservation projects.
Yes. So I was formerly a carnivore conservation director at an organization that worked mostly in the Western United States on large carnivore species out there, albeit I've been based in the Northeast for quite some time, but working on helping communities coexist with gray wolves, grizzly bears, mountain lions, and coyotes in the Western United States.
That's the work you were doing.
That I was formerly doing. Yes. Yes.
You flesh that out a little bit. What does that mean?
Yes, yeah. So I guess my educational background, I have a degree in wildlife ecology and as well as a law degree, and have focused on helping advance policy addressing carnivore conservation and coexistence. So in the Western United States, I helped local communities and states develop policies to help address things like human carnivore conflict with domestic animals. I helped communities adopt like community coexistence plans for living alongside species like coyotes and black bears, and did a lot of public education work kind of on a local and state level in the West. Yeah, and I can attach I think I forgot to do that, but attach a resume or a CV to give a bit more of that background.
Well, that'd be great. Do members have questions? Representative Chapin, then also.
I'd love to, so you're working regionally now on this. Are you talking with folks in other states and at other universities, and can you share any sense you have about different stakeholders that are pursuing this or interested?
Yeah, definitely. So my work is actually mostly, we are looking at this from a regional context, but I've been mostly working on the ground here in Vermont. I've been hosting a lot of public conversation. I'm calling them catamount conversations because I like alliterations. But yeah, going across the state and introducing the conversation over the potential restoration of this species, inquiring about people's thoughts and concerns and trying to gauge kind of stakeholder perspectives. I think some of the committee members have actually maybe attended a few of these. We've also brought in folks that have worked on community coexistence with mountain lions in the Western United States. We brought in Beth Pratt, who leads Save LA Cougars campaign in Los Angeles area to provide kind of insight on how urban communities in particular can coexist with large carnivores. I would say from a community perspective, we're hearing interest, some people, bringing up concerns and thoughts around the potential for conflicts with domestic animals and how we could address those. What would be the impacts to our deer populations? And so some real actual, questions over kind of like the nuts and bolts of what it would mean to bring the species back, but overall has been a fairly positive conversation. Yeah.
Representative Austin.
Everything I've read about the feasibility study and reintroducing the kind of talk about there's a really a trend or a theme that goes through everything I'm reading, which is community engagement, public engagement.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so can you help me understand how you frame that? I mean, in terms of so you can get accurate, data to kind of either support or refute a position?
Yeah, you mean to gauge like the public's, yeah. So I think I touched on in my testimony some of that initial polling survey data, right? Which has looked positive toward restoration in that we're seeing kind of a 12-to-1 ratio, right? So for every 12 people strongly supportive of catamount restoration, there's only one strongly opposed. I think from my understanding, researchers are currently in the process of doing more localized public survey data to better understand that at like a county and local level across the Northeast. I'm not sure the status of that. But I think that was kind of a question before about like, how do you gain proper understanding of like different stakeholder perspectives, right? And make sure you're properly reaching all the different demographic groups, stakeholder groups. I am not a social scientist, but I would welcome the committee to, I could, put you in contact with folks who have done some of that social science data to like dive into how they actually scale that data based on kind of the demographics of a specific state to ensure that they're properly representing each of those stakeholder groups. And I do think that the data that's currently published does break down by agricultural communities, hunter stakeholder groups. So I think there's that data in particular, you can kind of look at the different levels of support and opposition broken out by different stakeholder groups. But I would want to bring in a social scientist to provide kind of like an in-depth answer of how they properly scale that data to different stakeholders.
All right, thanks so much for your testimony. Members, we have our next witness at 2:30.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is Rebecca Pfeiffer joining us again, so you need to shift gears and start thinking about corridors again.